Thank you so much, Eloise. Everyone can hear me okay? Well, welcome to panel 6. This is Life in the Caribbean. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to introduce the first speaker. Our first person will be Matthew Lee. Matthew is a PhD researcher in the School of Language, Literature, Music, and Visual Culture at the University of Aberdeen. His research, which is in collaboration between Aberdeen and the National Library of Scotland, is funded by an AHRC Collaborative Doctoral Partnership Award. Matthew's thesis combines archival research with readings of text to interrogate the ways in which Scots presented and reflected on slavery, both in the public and private spheres. Matthew has a BA in history from the University of Strathclyde and an MLit in Scottish history from the University of Glasgow. And the title of his paper today is The Jamaica Journal of Alexander Ennis, Slavery and the Picturesque, excuse me. So let me turn it over to Matthew.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully this works. Window. Right. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes, it's good.
Yes, great, cool. Right, so today my paper is going to focus on one example of North East Scotland's colonial connections, the journal of the soldier and the plantation overseer, Alexander Ennis, who was from the Banffshire village of Rathven. His short journal, which conveys his private reflections on his experiences in Jamaica between December 1823 and February 1824, provide a detailed account of everyday life in a slave society. So in today's paper, I'll cover the broad contours of Ennis's biography, his connections to a Northeast network in Jamaica, his time as an overseer on a plantation, and subsequently his framing of the plantation complex in picturesque and also in sublime terms. So Ennis was baptised at Rathven Old Parish Church in 1792, and he was the son of Lieutenant Alexander Ennis of the 42nd Regiment, and his mother was called Catherine Duncan. His baptismal record shows that his maternal grandfather, John Duncan, was, quote, in the island of Jamaica at the point of his baptism, implying an ongoing relationship between the Ennis family and the West Indies. Mackie's mentioned yesterday about Rathven's links to the Caribbean via the herring trade, alongside this little fragment from the baptismal record, demonstrate that small northeast towns were very much a part of global flows of goods and people. In July 1810, he followed in his father's footsteps into the 42nd Regiment. He served in the Peninsular War. He was severely wounded at the Battle of Toulouse, and he also served at the Battle of Waterloo. It's actually the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo today, appropriately enough. Records about his military service have actually aided the attribution of the journal to Ennis, whose name doesn't actually appear anywhere in the manuscript. For example, the entry for the 13th of December 1823 notes that Kingston reminded the writer of the towns that he'd seen in Spain, a nod, if you like, to the kind of colonised space that Jamaica had become. A subsequent entry dated the 15th of February 1824 provides further evidence for this attribution. The entry mentions that a letter had been received by the journal writer's mother that advised him that he'd been appointed to the 94th Regiment, and around this time the London Gazette announced that an Alexander Ennis was due to become a lieutenant in that regiment, indicating again that Ennis was indeed the author of the journal. I'll just move to the next slide. So Ennis departed for Jamaica from Gravesend on the 23rd of October 1823, and he arrived in Kingston on the 18th of December 1823. 2 days later, he met a Mr. Christie, whom he called a fine genteel young man, and his partner, a Mr. Taylor. They were, in Ennis's words, the first merchants in this city. These men were probably Simon Taylor of Kingston and William Christie, both of who had Scottish roots. Christie and Taylor had business ties to an Alexander McEnnis, a plantation manager and owner and enslaver, who helped Ennis throughout his stint in Jamaica. In turn, Christie and Taylor and McInnes had links to John and William Shand, and the Shands were enslavers who variously managed and owned plantations across Jamaica, and their country home in Fettercairn, known as the Burn, is located around halfway between Aberdeen and Dundee and is now a retreat for academics. Christie and Taylor sold sugar that had been grown by enslaved people on the Shands estates. Meanwhile, McInnes was the attorney for Belmont Estate and Clifton Pen, both of which Ennis visited during his time in Jamaica. The overseer at Belmont named McHattie, a relative of McInnes, welcomed Ennis to the estate, quote, in the kindest manner. Lots of Ennises and McInneses there. It was through McInnes that Ennis was able to, quote, learn the plantation business, and he did so at Colbeck's estate in St Dorothy's parish, and he became overseer at Colbeck's, quote, at the request of McInnes. And contact between Ennis and other people from the northeast continued throughout the duration of his stay. On the 20th of February 1824, shortly before he left the island, he dined with, quote, a large party of gentlemen from the counties of Aberdeen and Banff. The next day, at Cherry Garden Estate, Ennis dined with a man from Huntly, whom he identified as Mr. Smith. It seems to me that Ennis's journal provides clear evidence of an active network, northeast network, I should say, in Jamaica in the 1820s. Let's move on to the next slide. Ennis visited or named at least 8 plantations in his journal, either to work or to socialise. As you can see in this table, he came into the proximity of almost 1,500 enslaved people during these visits. Ennis arrived at Colbeck's on the 8th of January 1824. Less than a week later, he recorded the first example of violence contained in the journal. Ennis was, quote, shocked beyond measure at the inhuman, cruel manner in which the estate overseer, Mr. Spencer, had, quote, directed a poor old female slave to be punished. The enslaved woman in question was large in the family way, in Ennis's words. And this detail suggests that even pregnant women were exposed to corporal punishment at Colbeck's. 4 days later, Spencer was relieved of his duties, and he was replaced by a man called Orkney named Simpson, whom Ennis described as a vulgar-looking fellow. And he commenced his career by flogging 6 enslaved people who were under Ennis's direct charge. And apparently this group of poor creatures, in Ennis's words, asked him to assist and to protect them. And he went on to have what he calls a serious row with Mr. Simpson, and he frightened him by threatening to report him to Mr. McInnes. Simpson apologised profusely and promised that he wouldn't intervene with any of the enslaved people who were under Ennis's authority. And I would argue that this threat is a kind of another nod to the power of this northeast network. Nevertheless, Simpson continued to inflict cruelty on the enslaved people that Ennis said would have shocked the most unfeeling heart. They had another disagreement on the 14th of February when Simpson wanted to flog an enslaved man named James, who'd run away from Colbeck's, then returned. Ennis claimed that he interceded on James's behalf and that he was spared the flogging. And significantly, Ennis assumed the position of a shocked onlooker who witnessed violence but never inflicted it. Instead, he cast himself as a protector of the enslaved people in his midst and an active opponent of miscreant overseers like Spencer and Simpson. He believed that he was in fact beloved by Colbeck's enslaved population. For example, when he fell ill, a group of enslaved people visited him and brought him bundles of fruit. He presented these actions as the result of what he calls lenity and kindness, not coercion, funnily enough. Given his role as an overseer, it seems improbable that Ennis did not administer punishment to the enslaved people at Colbeck's. And the tension between his stated role and his actual job on the estate calls into question the veracity of his journal and hints at the gaps and the silences in his account. Reflecting the complexity of his self-portrayal, Ennis's professed opposition to the violence that he saw did not convert him to abolitionism. He believed that emancipation promised to make enslaved people, quote, the most miserable creatures on earth. And this inability to translate what he had seen into an outright condemnation of slavery reflects but one of the contradictory elements of Ennis's reflections on his time at Colbeck's. And as we'll turn to now, Ennis's portrayal of the plantation was never straightforward. Just bear with me a second. Structured around a return journey from Scotland to Jamaica and then within Jamaica itself, and written by a self-aware traveller, Ennis's journal can be read as a piece of travel literature, which Roy Bridges describes as a discourse designed to describe and interpret for its readers a geographical area together with its natural attributes and human society and culture. And the journal conforms to this definition as it describes Jamaica's landscape. It reflects on enslavement as a central feature of Jamaica's social and labour relations, and it also discusses enslaved people's cultural practices, for example, music and dance. And Ennis perceived himself very much as an explorer of terra incognita. He made a direct reference to Columbus and Captain Cook, both of whom, like Ennis, were colonisers and travel writers. Indeed, the journal represents what Kelly Wisecup has termed a conquest narrative. These narratives were developed by colonisers like Columbus and then recycled into subsequent texts that were published about colonised spaces into the 19th century. And they present these spaces like the Caribbean as beautiful and abundant and open to scientific and economic exploration and indeed exploitation. And the labour of enslaved people, which undergird their productive capacity, is either hidden or presented as the outcome of a mutual arrangement between enslaver and enslaved. So along these lines, scientific measurements recur in the section of the journal. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, can you still see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay. My Teams had a freak out there and disappeared along with my slides. So scientific measurements recur in the section of the journal recounting Ennis's voyage across the Atlantic. He calculated the difference in latitude and longitude between his then current position and the village of Cullen near Banff. And in so doing, he compared the seemingly strange with the reassuringly familiar, underscoring the notion that he was going to an othered space. So even before he set foot in Jamaican soil, therefore, Ennis believed himself to be an explorer of a place that was fundamentally different from his northeast home. And the portrayals of the plantations in the journal focus on the field of aesthetics, including sensory experience, notions of beauty, sublimity, and the picturesque. So just to define these terms before we go any further, according to Edmund Burke, who wrote an influential treatise on aesthetics, smallness, smoothness, and delicacy were the markers of beauty, while vastness and objects that excite ideas of pain and danger, in Burke's words, accord with the sublime. Likewise, William Gilpin, who was a theorist of the picturesque, correlated beauty with smoothness and the picturesque with roughness. And you can see the roughness of Jamaica's landscape in this illustration, which is taken from James Hakewell's 1825 text, A Picturesque Tour of the Island of Jamaica. As Matthew Whitman has noted, Scotland, particularly the Highlands, was portrayed in 18th and 19th century travel literature in sublime and picturesque terms. And Ennis evoked these terms in his journal, and so therefore he used the language of travel texts written about Scotland to frame his representations of Jamaica. For example, he was struck by, quote, the sublime grandeur of the lofty Blue Mountains, which you can see in the background of this slide, again from Hakewell's text. Their summits, quote, invaded the regions of ether and towered in majestic grandeur above McInnes's Razamount estate. The sublime and picturesque vistas at Razamount convinced Ennis that it was, quote, without exceptions, the most romantic place he had seen. Another journal entry depicts Colbecks in similar terms. The estate was, quote, interspersed with a ridge of steep hills that tumbled in stupendous manner upon one another. Although soilless, the hills had a great variety of trees, which were nourished by the rains which fall often, or the mists which continually brood on the mountains. Rocks formed, quote, many small rivers of pure wholesome water, which tumbled down in cataracts. These rivers, quote, together with the stupendous height of the mountains and the bright verdure of the trees, formed a most delightful landscape. Simon Newton has noted, picturesque depictions of plantations present a quote, well-ordered and lightly populated version of the kind of plantation complex, wherein virtually no enslaved people are in view. The image you can see on this slide provides a good example of that. We can see one enslaved person standing at the gate, but behind the gate, no other enslaved people or their labour can be seen. Ennis's depiction of Colbecks almost entirely elides the presence of enslaved people. Throughout the long passage from which I just quoted, he made a single cursory reference to, in his words, 300 Negroes, that is, enslaved people, who lived there. Their work in the cultivation of coffee that grew in great plenty on the estate is masked by the language of the picturesque and the sublime. The renderings of the plantations Ennis visited conform to Elizabeth Bowles' concept of the planter picturesque, an implicitly politicised effort to project a sanitised image of the plantation to metropolitan readers by, quote, visually arresting Jamaica within the formalist conventions of the picturesque. It's important to note that Ennis wasn't writing explicitly for the public, not at least at this time, but his journal nevertheless contains these sterilised renderings that conform to Bowles's concept. The illusion in Ennis's picturesque descriptions offer a notable counterpoint to the depictions of corporal punishment on callbacks that I discussed earlier. By utilising the language of the picturesque and the sublime, he turned sites of exploitation into picturesque paradises. Through his use of aesthetic language, Ennis created deeply contradictory representations of the plantation complex. Yep, just be 2 seconds. He created deeply contradictory representations of the plantation complex. At times, callbacks is the scene of shocking violence, never committed by Ennis apparently, and at others it's a romantic picturesque idyll. So these brief examples demonstrated that Ennis viewed Jamaica through the lens of aesthetics, which allowed him to develop warped portrayals of plantation life. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthew.
Sorry,
I hope I'm not being too much of a time master here, but
no,
really
I was having all sorts of issues at my end with my slides kept disappearing, and as did my Teams window. But anyway, I hope you heard it all.
Well, we can see it and hear it perfectly, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Our next presenter is Elise Mitchell. Elise is a PhD candidate in Atlantic World and Caribbean and Latin American History at New York University and a visiting scholar at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her dissertation, Smallpox and Slavery, examines how smallpox outbreaks, public health interventions, and medical practices impacted enslaved Africans' lives during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries across Spanish, Portuguese, French, and British Atlantic contexts. Her scholarship will appear in the forthcoming volumes, Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery, which will be from Louisiana State University Press, and Early Modern Medicine, a source-centered introduction, which is under contract with Routledge. The title of her paper today is The Doctor to the Plantation Negroes and the Negro Doctor, Slavery, Masculinity, and Medical Expertise in 18th Century Jamaica. Elise.
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's truly an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm actually not going to be presenting on my dissertation research today. I'll be presenting on work that's part of a new project. Over the course of my dissertation research, I was able to conduct some inquiries into records in the Jamaican Archives and Records Department and National Library, as well as on the Kew, and also worked in Alexander Johnston's papers, who was a Scottish physician in St. Anne, Jamaica, between roughly 1767 and his death in the late 1780s. And while using these records, I found a number of records in the Jamaican archives that cast Johnston's papers in a new light, because they describe the free people of color in St. Anne at the time and reveal that far more free people of color, as well as enslaved people, were treated by Johnston than historians were previously able to acknowledge. With these new findings in mind, I decided to develop a microhistorical project that foregrounds enslaved and free people of color's quotidian encounters with emerging professional medical networks, colonial medical institutions, and local medical economies in St. Anne, Jamaica. For this presentation, I'm focused on masculine medical professional networks and how they mediated enslaved men's training and labor as healers. Broadly, what possibilities did Scottish networks of medical men foreclose or create for enslaved men and boys in St. Anne during the late 18th century? Historians have long traced the history of Scottish trained medical professionals throughout the Americas and wider Atlantic. Much of the scholarship has focused on the circulation of medical knowledge and military medical practitioners. Alan Carris, who has specifically worked on Alexander Johnston, previously exposed the importance of these Scottish professional networks in Johnston's own social ascent and career, as well as many other Scotsmen in Jamaica. And historians have also already traced the history of professionalization and training for Black women healers in the British Caribbean and Black men healers in other parts of the Caribbean and South America. For example, there's a robust Brazilian historiography and several Spanish American texts that detail the ways in which enslaved Black healers participated within existing colonial medical institutions rather than solely operating outside of them. And in the Anglo-Americas, historians, notably Sasha Turner, Catherine Paugh, and for the antebellum US context, Deirdre Cooper Owens, have examined how Black women, the roles that Black women played as midwives in plantation societies, and how intergenerational networks of Black women healers passed on their expertise and authority. So in my own work, I've also found evidence of free Black women nurses who worked in British Caribbean almshouses, but I haven't found similar evidence of free Black men healers. Free Black men tended to operate in other skilled trades, such as tailoring or as coopers as well. And likewise, there's also a relatively broad historiography, notably work by Diana Patton, focusing on the history of Obeah and Obeah practitioners throughout the Caribbean. And Rana Hogarth's work demonstrates that they posed a threat to the emerging colonial British medical establishment in the island. But I'm particularly interested in this presentation in tracing how enslaved and free people of color social statuses and professional identities were shaped by the margins of these colonial medical networks. And in this paper, I'm focusing on tracking this by tracing the labor of one enslaved man named Gillen, who Alexander Johnston purchased as a boy and trained to become his medical assistant. In 1765, an enslaved African boy arrived in Kingston. He did not know that he would spend his adolescence and much of his young adult life as a medical assistant to Alexander Johnston, an aspiring doctor in St. Anne, Jamaica. In the 1760s, Kingston was the principal mart of the island, quote unquote. More broadly a major Caribbean thoroughfare. This African boy would have entered a bustling port and been taken to Hibbert's and Jackson's pen on Orange Street while he awaited sale. There he would have been surrounded by enslaved Africans in varying states of illness and injury, including those destined to remain in Jamaica and those who would have been shipped on to other Caribbean and North American ports via the intra-American slave trade, which the historian Gregory O'Malley has deftly outlined in his published research as well as his digital scholarship. It was here that Alexander Fullerton, the mentor of Alexander Johnston, Fullerton, who was known throughout the island as a, quote, doctor to the plantation Negroes, purchased this boy who would become Galen and 5 other enslaved boys, all between the ages of 10 and 13, who Johnston would later name George, Qua, Bristol, Forrester, and Quashie. Or at least that's what he called them if he didn't name them those names himself. All 6 of them would endure the journey north across the island, likely over rough wooded terrain or perhaps on board a ship around the island to St. Anne's Bay. St. Anne was a comparatively small parish on the northern coast of Jamaica, somewhat removed from the colony's commercial centers in the south and west coasts. In his History of Jamaica, the British slave owner and official William Beckford barely devoted a paragraph to what he described as a group of about 40 houses straggling along the bay and villages, quote, so small as to scarcely deserve that name. St. Anne's vestry minutes from this period indicate that vestry members struggled to convince Jamaican Assembly to secure St. Anne's Bay from Spanish smuggling and rogue Cubans who were, quote unquote, inveiling away enslaved Africans. And there were quite a few Scottish migrants living in the area. Sugar did not dominate the economy. It was primarily ranching as well as foodstuffs, although there were some sugar plantations in the area. 2 short years before Galen's arrival in 1763, the 24-year-old named Alexander Johnston left Scotland to pursue a medical career in Jamaica. Johnston arrived in Jamaica with his naval surgeon's mate certificate, his word that he'd attended medical school at the University of Aberdeen, and no other reputation as a, quote, practitioner of physic and surgery to speak of. The historian Alan Carris has shown that Johnston was one of many aspirational Scotsmen to flee Scotland armed with a partial medical education in the hopes of finding fortune in the Americas. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War and amid increasingly competitive educational and professional landscape, medical practitioners from Scotland in particular left in search of further training and fortunes in the Americas. And Johnston began his career, of course, with Alexander Fullerton, who, in addition to hiring him as an apprentice, also financed much of his lifestyle, including purchasing enslaved Africans, and helped him navigate Jamaican society in his early days. Gillen and the other people who Johnston enslaved were introduced to Caribbean society and labor in a manner that was slightly different from enslaved people on larger sugar plantations. Rather than being seasoned and acclimated to harsh plantation labor on Johnston's properties, Johnston, with Fullerton's guidance, hired out the enslaved people to his neighbors in order to repay his debts to Fullerton. Both Fullerton and Johnston viewed the purchase of the boys as an investment that would pay dividends because there was a local demand for boys and young men with skilled and unskilled labor in St. Anne. They typically worked as coopers, carpenters, veterinarians, medical assistants, tailors, and waiting boys. As they grew older, Johnston would continue to hire them out to perform labor on his neighbor's land as well as his own. However, Johnston could not hire out enslaved people who were suffering from contagious illnesses, which unfortunately Galen was when he arrived. Shortly after he arrived, he came down with yaws. And while the other enslaved people were sent to a man named Edward Hanachers, Galen remained with Johnston. Now, this disease frequently affected enslaved African children in the Caribbean. It's a contagious disease that causes painful lesions that usually on the hands and feet, and if left untreated, can cause severe joint and bone loss. And the lesions, if they become open sores, can easily infect others who come in contact with them. So there were widespread concerns in the Caribbean that enslaved people could pass this disease to one another. And Catherine Paul and Ronna Hogarth have written more extensively on some of the racialized stereotypes about the disease, which I'm happy to address in the Q&A. While Galen recovered, he bore witness to the emotional and physical toll that both the slave trade and enslavement took on enslaved people's bodies. Roughly a year after his arrival, Johnston purchased enslaved women named Susanna, Mary, and two more women whose names Johnston does not provide from a local merchant named William Robertson, as well as a Jewish merchant, Aaron Barra Lusada, who trafficked ill and ailing enslaved people from Hibbert's and Jackson's pen in Kingston to St. Anne. Shortly after these women arrived, one of the unnamed women committed suicide, and the other unnamed woman died of dropsy in an extreme form of edema. These diseases would have likely impacted young Galen, who himself had just survived his own harrowing voyage across the Atlantic and his own set of moribund and uncertain experiences in Hibbert's and Jackson's pen. Mary, who was in her teens or 20s, suffered from a severe sore on her leg at the time that Johnston purchased her and was still in a great deal of pain and struggled to walk when he hired her out. She fled Hanachers twice between 1767 and 1769, perhaps seeking some recovery, but to no avail. As Galen bore witness to her being disciplined as well as her flight, but not the circumstances at Hanachers that caused her to flee, this may have inculcated him with ideas about white authority and conditioned him to both fear and oblige white authorities like Johnston. By July 1769, when Galen was about 15 years old, he had fully recovered from yaws and joined Mary and the others at Hanachers briefly, but he would not remain working in Hanachers fields. Several months later, on the morning of April 23rd, 1770, Galen gathered whatever meager belongings he had, including a knife that he got from Johnston, and headed to the Trelawney Barracks for a one-year apprenticeship under Dr. Thompson. Now, these barracks were built in the aftermath of the First Maroon War, roughly 1730 to 1739, and were updated in the wake of Tacky's revolt in 1760. So Galen would have worked alongside other enslaved African medical assistants at the barracks and crossed paths with local Maroons in Trelawney. In West Africa, boys and men were inculcated into medical and healing knowledge that had been passed down for generations, often along preordained spiritual and ancestral lines. Unlike his African ancestors, whose training would have been indigenous African or Eastern medical traditions, Galen learned humoral medical practices from and hybrid Jamaican healing traditions that emerged under colonialism during his time there. After Galen returned, Johnston ceased inventorying him as a field slave and began referring to him as a doctor. It's unclear what exactly Johnston meant by that or what type of training Galen received. Historians have written extensively about the healing tradition Obeah, a mixture of West and West Central African healing and spiritual practices developed among enslaved and Maroon African communities in Jamaica. Many Maroon leaders were feared and awed as Obeah priests and healers. After Tacky's revolt in 1760, Jamaican legislators outlawed obeah and made it punishable by death. Executions were not infrequent throughout Jamaica during this time, even in the more sparsely populated parishes like St. Anne. For example, Guy, an enslaved man, a man who was enslaved by Thomas Mumby, was executed for, quote, the practice of obeah in August of 1772. Now, Mumby was a client of Johnston's. At some point, Johnston and Galen likely crossed paths with Guy, or those who knew him. His execution would have sent shockwaves through the community of enslaved and free people of color in St. Anne, who were frequently hired out to their enslavers' neighbors, as well as hired out to the vestry in order to build roads. So news spread quickly in this community. After Guy's execution, enslaved African medical practitioners, particularly men, would have been more wary of possible accusations of obeah, and likely went to great lengths to ensure that their practices were kept secret or appeared to be in accordance with British medical traditions, which would prevent obeah accusations. Between 1768 and 1788, several enslaved Africans were accused and convicted of obeah in St. Anne. The presence of multiple accused and convicted obeah practitioners demonstrates the popularity of the practice in the region, as well as the extent to which other enslaved and free communities of people of African descent deferred to these practitioners. However, the majority of these practitioners were men, which suggests that male healers were perceived to pose a particular kind of threat within the British colonial sphere. And it shouldn't be lost on us that many of the vestry members in St. Anne were, in fact, themselves medical practitioners. They're listed invariably as surgeons or practitioners of medicine and physics. Thus, the threat that, which is something that the historian Rana Hogarth has outlined in her work, was something that was very close to home to these vestry men who were convicting men of this kind of practice. And so these concerns over healing practices also intersected with the expansion of the British military presence in the aftermath of Tacky's revolt, as well as the expansion in Trelawney's in the Trelawney region. So anyway, to conclude, at 15, Galen was able to go where a few other enslaved men and boys were able to go before, traveling by himself to learn a life-saving skill. This opportunity came at a crucial point in his life, as he was likely trying to situate himself within the colonial society as a young man. However, his positionality separated him from other enslaved people, which is something that I'm happy to discuss at length in the Q&A. And Johnston's specialized treatment of him, both terming him a Negro doctor, as well as the number of gifts and freedoms that he afforded Galen, may have put him at odds with other enslaved people in the community. Nevertheless, this seems like it may have been one of the few routes for enslaved men, or for men of color, period, to be able to participate within the emerging medical establishment in late 18th century Jamaica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elise. And we're coming up on our final speaker. And if you have any questions, again, please put those in the chat. Our final speaker is Dr. Dasha Osborne. Dr. Osborne teaches literature in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies at Hunter College at the City University of New York. She completed her PhD in English at the University of Cambridge, where her research was a full-length study of the Caribbean epic poem Maruna, an historical romance in poetic form, published in 2015. In 2019, she was a Désha Manning Fellow in 18th Century Scottish Studies at IASH in the University of Edinburgh. Her current research project explores the networks of interconnected families from the northeast of Scotland who left their homes in the late 18th century to settle and colonize in the Eastern Caribbean. And the title of her paper today is John and Sophia, Race, Colonialism, and the Creation of Family Narratives in Aberdeen. Dr. Osborne.
Thank you, Daniel. Can everybody hear me and see my slides?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So just before I start, I just wanted to make a quick, short modification to my talk. I intended to focus on John and Sophia, the subjects of two of the many subjects in my the larger project I'm working on right now on Northeast Scottish men and their the enslaved women and children in St. Vincent and Grenada. But for the purposes of time, I'm going to just give as much information as I can about my findings on Sophia. I will, again, be open to discussing other people in the Q&A. So I'd like to begin my talk with an image. This painting and the many others like it, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, that depict life in the Eastern Caribbean, were made by the Roman artist Agostino Bernays, who arrived there through the patronage of the first Sir William Young. These images have always been used merely as representational or even emblematic of this period in Caribbean history. No doubt the opening up of archives across the Caribbean, Europe, and the United States in recent years have now created a space where we are one step closer to actually identifying these unnamed African, indigenous, and mixed race, both free and enslaved people in these paintings. I hope that my current project helps to further this act of identifying both, across time, that by joining the works of others like Elsa Govia, Sasha Turner, Annette Gordon-Reed, Brooke Newman, Jennifer Morgan, Christine Walker, Brenda Stevenson, Dana Rami Berry, Leslie Harris, Barbara Bush, Lisa Williams, who was here yesterday, and even our chair, Daniel, whose work I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In exploring, recuperating, and acknowledging the lives of enslaved women and children affected by the mass movements of men, and in our case, Scottish men, into colonized spaces. The aim of my talk today will be to introduce you to one of those individuals, Sophia Ross. Because of her mother's enslaved status, she was also born with that status. She was manumitted only at the end of her father's life and forced into a world in Aberdeen, surrounded by some close relatives who refused to acknowledge their familiar connection. Sophia's father left his home in Aberdeenshire in the years following the 1863 Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War. He joined hundreds of men from the Northeast region's large network of interconnected families who filled posts as carpenters, surveyors, overseers, managers, blacksmiths, attorneys, soldiers, ministers of the gospel, and most importantly, enslavers, who made profit from planting sugarcane, cotton, coffee, and indigo throughout the ceded islands of St. Vincent, Grenada, Tobago, Dominica, the Grenadine Islands, and by those I mean chiefly Bequia, Carriacou, Canouan, Mustique, and Union Island. And that the ceded islands also include the short-lived colonies of East and West Florida. In 1767, John Ross left his family estate at Arnage in Ellen for the prospects of wealth and adventure in British West Florida. Ross, like almost all the men so far discussed at this conference, had a role in the trade in enslaved Africans and plantation slavery that has yet to be reckoned with. What brought me to this research, and I'll just cover this really briefly, what brought me to this research was expanding work started during my PhD on the epic poem Hairuna. The central scene of the poem is this moment of single combat between the Garifuna chief Joseph Chatoyer and Alexander Leith of the family of Glenkindie and Freefield, who now in St. Vincentian history, the history of St. Vincent and that of Belize and parts of the Garifuna diaspora is known. He's known infamously as the man who killed the Garifuna chief. He is hated across these spaces. And my work was focused on expanding elements of this glorification, this symbolism of that moment as the moment of Leith killing Chatouillet. And you can see there's a really well-known painting in St. Vincent that is on display at Fort Charlotte. It was commissioned in the 1970s to kind of to posit Leith and Chatouillet in this struggle for control of the island. And what part of my work has been to try to uncover, by showing the disparity in the historical record, by looking at Leith's extended family and what role they had in the perpetuation of this fiction as fact. And I think the role here is the central role here is to think about the way that the writing of fiction has proved itself to be better equipped in some ways, in other ways lesser than historical writing for many people in the Caribbean. The two Leith family archives at the Special Collections Library at Aberdeen helped me to paint these incomplete portraits of the difficult and very depressing lives of Bella, her daughters, Sophia, and Margaret Ross. So while the traces remain, part of the reason for their stories being incomplete is deliberate. And just briefly to talk about what you're seeing here in front of you, this is a kind of brief overview of how these two families connect. That of the Leith family of Freefield and Glenkindie, and the house of the family in Arnage, through the marriage of Alexander Leith to Martha Ross, and how John Monroe Leith, the children of Leith and St. Vincent, are how their lives were parallel to the children of John Ross, who emigrated to East Florida and later on Dominica. I'll come back to that slide soon. Alexander Johnston, this is not the same man as who Elise was speaking about. His 1860 publication for the University Press at Aberdeen, titled A Short Memoir of James Young and Rachel Cruikshank, his spouse, was expanded on 34 years later by his nephew William Johnston into a genealogical account of the descendants of James Young and Rachel Cruikshank. And this is where the connection and close interaction between the Leiths of Glenkindie and Freefield and the Rosses of Arnage are materializing. The experience of these two girls and their relationship with both their enslaved African and Aberdonian relatives have until now remained conspicuously concealed within the boxes in the Special Collections Library. Personal letters, journals, deeds, and testaments, in addition to newspapers and financial accounts found in these archives, as well as other ones in the U.S. and the Caribbean, offer insight into the worlds of many natural or quote not natural or reputed children lost to memory and history. Throughout their lives, the idea of family for people like Sophia became a negotiation between kinship and identity, of reconciling an African Scottishness created through acts of sexual violence, then sustained through unfair and unequal religious and domestic aggressions. Sophia Ross, as I noted before, she was born in St. Augustine, East Florida. Her mother Bella was an enslaved African forced to work on the estates owned by William Elliot, son of Sir Gilbert Elliot, 3rd Baronet of Stubbs. I could find no information about Bella before her arrival in either Georgia or East Florida. Sophia's father was John Christian Ross, baptized in 1730 in Ellen to John Ross of Arnage and Elizabeth Turner of Turner Hall. The castle at Arnage had only been in the family's possession for about 2 generations, beginning with the second Laird's father, also named John Ross, who served as provost of Aberdeen in the early 18th century. The family's previous home is the building that now houses the Maritime Museum. In the employment of Elliot, it was Ross's job to trade and market captive men, women, and children of African descent from the neighboring colonies on the American continent and the West Indies to break ground on the new plantations in the once inhospitable swamplands of the Florida coast. It was around the time of his trip to Georgia that Ross, as plantation estate manager, trafficked Bella, her young son Davy, along with about 50 other African captives to labor on Elliot's plantations. Margaret, nicknamed Peggy, was born soon after, followed by Sophia, or Sophie, in 1773. A letter that I found within the Leith Ross family papers, dated in 1776, to his father at Arnage, asking for money to purchase Bella and the girls, makes it clear that John Ross wanted to own them because of his personal dispute with Elliot, who, despite Ross's change in employment, would have still claimed ownership of them, and not because he cared too deeply for them. In the final years of the War for American Independence, Ross, like many British colonists in the Florida colonies, abandoned their settlements and plantations for the West Indies. John took all that he owned, which now included Bella and Davy, and transplanted to Dominica. Before leaving, he manumitted Peggy and Sophia, then sent them to live with his father and sister Christian at Arnage Castle. Ross's motivations for sending Sophia and Peggy to Scotland are not clear, but one reason might be an attempt to avoid a future for the girls that involved the well-known institution that was for a time called mulatto concubinage, a fundamental part of the foundation of enslaved societies in the Americas, and essential to islands in the Eastern Caribbean. Another speculation could be Peggy's health, which continued to deteriorate after the girls arrived in Scotland. Although it could never be truly understood what life at Arnage Castle was like for Peggy and Sophia, a few traces remain. Both girls were baptized on September 16th, 1782 at Bairnie and Tillydusk in the Scottish Episcopal Church. Other traces are letters exchanged between John and Dominica, who it seems was waiting to recover from illness before making the journey back to Ellen, and his father and Christian, who seems to have been personally in charge of the girls. In her letter, they're affectionately referred to as her little lassies. In her letter to her brother, Christian documents Peggy's mysterious illness and also stated that while the girls were incapable of writing a letter to him on account of only being able to copy words into their lesson book, Peggy's illness also prevented her from attending the same school as Sophia, who was traveling to Aberdeen to a school run by Mrs. Ramsey and Burnett. The girls nonetheless asked her to beg him to return. He never did. John died less than a year later in 86, and was buried in Dominica. Before we begin to romanticize too much about the relationship between father and daughter, John's death, unfortunately, provides one last clue to the story of Bella's life before she disappears from the record. It isn't clear what happened to Bella after he died, but the codicil to John's will provides some clue. Within 2 days of this document's writing, he was dead. And I'm just going to read the portion of it. It is my particular will and desire that my 2 slaves, named York and Bella, be sold by Mr. Rainey, my executor, to such masters as they themselves shall choose. The cruelty of the short codicil emotes feelings of anger, precipitousness, and one last display of power from Ross on his deathbed. We are only left to imagine what he perceived York and Bella to have done to afford the added indignity of being sold with or without their clothes. The postscript to Bella's presence in the official record should remind us of what Claude Landsman calls the obscenity of the project of understanding. While there are acknowledged gaps in the record, it's safe to say that Sophia never saw her mother again either. Margaret, trafficking the events of Bella's life is only possible so long as she remains useful to Ross. Margaret died not long after, sometime between the deaths of her father and her grandfather. With John and later his father's death 3 years later, Christian Ross and a young nephew named John Leith Ross became co-heirs of the Arnage estate. The boy's mother, Margaret, was the second wife of Leith of Glenkindie and Freefield. Leith Ross grew up in Glenkindie Castle and later studied law and lived in Edinburgh. On Christian Ross's death in 1803, he became the sole Laird of Arnage, changing his name from Ross John Leith to John Ross Leith, and moved to the castle, where his Leith Ross descendants continued until 1968. When compiling the notes for his genealogy, Alexander Johnston makes the point of calling Sophia and Margaret's move to Aberdeen unnecessary. And he even calls Peggy's death fortunate. On December 9, 1788, around aged 15, Sophia married Turner Donaldson, the son of William Donaldson, crofters on the Ellen estate and distant relations to the Turners of Turner Hall. Sophia and Turner had at least 14 children between 1788 and 1811. When Christian Ross died in 1803, she left Sophia an annuity of £30, which was administered by her younger cousin, who was now the third Lord of Arnage. Sophia was denied the fullness of her inheritance because of her African enslaved mother. And when left at the discretion of her cousin, she was deemed unworthy of even the £30, which I should note is would have been equal to about 200 days' wages for a skilled tradesman. I'm just going to wrap up really quickly. I do have a lot more to say. I'll just run through my slides just to say that Sophia is missing from the record for about 20 years, and she returns to it, but by way of the conviction of two of her 14 sons, one Alexander, who was convicted of theft and transported to Australia, where he married and lived. And we don't know, but he married and lived until 1857, and her other son Thomas, who was one of the three men, who were three of the last executions, public executions in Aberdeen. So again, I will. I think I closed up. I will end here. I'm sorry for rushing through. I just again, we can have time to speak in the chat. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Osborne. So we have about 7 minutes for questions, and I saw a question in the chat which I'll just pose, and then I have a few of my own. This is for Matthew. Matthew, do you know if Enes's journal was intended for publication, and if so, who the audience might have been?
He doesn't actually say. This is a question that since I came across the journal, because I've not really been able to answer it. He does mention at one point when he came back from Jamaica, he was on an army barracks in Portsmouth, I think at this point, that he read one of his friend's manuscripts about a travelogue related to Africa. He doesn't say whether or not he shared the manuscript with his own manuscript with this friend, but kind of hints at the possibility that maybe he was circulating it. There's also little bits of it that read, they're almost kind of encyclopedic in tone, where he refers to Columbus and Captain Cook and descriptions of the Blue Mountains and things like that, that possibly he was maybe starting to prepare something for publication, but it's hard to say.
Great, thanks. And again, if people have more questions, you could put those in the chat. I have a question for Elise. It's such a fascinating project, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about maybe what is happening with sort of what Galen's actual work routine. Do you have a sense about what kinds of healing practices he's engaged with? I mean, I know when you look through enslaved inventories, you get a lot of women who are doing midwifery and other aspects like that. Do you have any sense of kind of the range of occupations that he was involved with in his medical practice?
Sorry. Okay. So he's so interesting as a figure in terms of how he shows up in the archive, as are the ways in which enslaved women show up in the archive here. in this project. I don't get a clear sense of what his day-to-day work routine was, but Johnston repeatedly mentions that he's accompanying him on his different sort of routes to treat enslaved people and free people of color on neighboring properties in St. Anne. He also talks about the other kinds of labor that he performed for Johnston, like delivering letters for folks and between he and his friends, and also herding cattle and other things, but doesn't talk specifically about the kind of medicine he practiced or what his responsibilities were for Johnston. I'm sorry, there's a bit of construction going on outside of my home. Whereas for enslaved women, they are almost virtually absent from Johnston's records, which is interesting to me too, given how present they are within vestry records in terms of working within almshouses, sometimes even free women of color listed by name. And prior to the late 18th century, in records I've seen, you tend to see more references to enslaved women, midwives, and things like that. But whereas in Johnston, he talks about tons of enslaved women who provided even him with medical care, but doesn't actually list them as having any credential within his inventories, which is part of what makes Galen so curious to me in this case. So I'm not sure if that quite answers the question.
No, that's really helpful, and I can imagine there's probably a lot of absence in those journals to talk about the specifics of his work. For Dr. Osborne, I'm obviously fascinated by this project. I think it's so interesting, and that family is so incredible. I wonder, do you see much with Peggy and Sophia? Do you have many records of any of their future connections, or once they're in Britain, do they have any connections back to the West Indies at all? Is there any writing in which they talk about that? And then is the Ross family in general, do you see them maintaining connections to the West Indies, or do they sort of transform away from that by the early 19th century?
Quick no to both questions. Once Peggy and Sophie arrive in Aberdeen, they stay there. Haven't yet found any death certificate, so I don't know where Sophia ended her life. Most likely it was in Aberdeen. The last record I have of her is around 1830. And as far as the Ross family, it's also severed. That Ross family from Arnage, there are no other connections there. There was an earlier Ross cousin from that family who left, who was in Barbados about 50 years before, but again, there isn't much to connect to.
Thanks. Maybe one kind of final question for everybody is just kind of, I wonder if the periodization is really important to your project. So for Matthew, is it important to think about kind of the 1820s as being this period in which there's maybe a lot of pessimism about the future of the West Indies, economically speaking, for Ennis, and how that might shape the way he's viewing his travels? And then for Elise and for Dr. Osborne, do you see kind of the rampant push to import as many enslaved Africans into the West Indies in this late 18th century period? Do you see that having an impact on the actors in your profiles as well?
In terms of Ennis, he doesn't really mention specifically whether it's a good or a bad idea to be going to Jamaica in 1823. He does talk in the journal at one point about conversations that he and his friends have actually at Christmas dinner about enslaved people in Jamaica being kind of useless at that point and the potential for trouble on the island. But kind of looking at secondary material, apparent that, falling rates of profit and all that kind of stuff in Jamaica in the 1820s, leading to kind of more harsh labour regimes in some instances. So that sort of indicates to me that this idea that Ennis just watched people being, violent to enslaved people and didn't do any of that himself isn't a particularly sort of tenable kind of line of argument that he offers. But yeah, as I say, he doesn't really kind of offer any reflections on the wisdom of going to Jamaica at that point.
Elise or Dr. Osborne, do you have any thoughts? Or
Yeah, I mean, what my work is on the Eastern Caribbean, and as far as particularly St. Vincent and Grenada, and as far as the continuance of enslavement, there was large disparities in terms of the amount of manumissions had to be suppressed because there were so many children being born. And they were actually in Grenada, a few of the laws at the end of the 18th century were actually put in place to fine people and limit how much they were able to leave in their wills, for example. They put a limit, I think, of 2,000 pounds. But as far as the actual trade goes, all the way to 1807, I think it's consistent with the rest of the Caribbean.
So I'll go ahead and answer. I think a couple of things happened that are pretty significant for the time period that I'm focusing on. The push to import more enslaved Africans certainly increased the presence of physicians, particularly British trained physicians, but it was also the fact that it's a post-war period. So we're dealing with the period after the 7 Years' War, in which you have a lot of these naval surgeons who are sort of looking for a home, and they oftentimes end up in the British colonies. And then I'm also looking at the period right after Tacky's War, and at a time when fears around enslaved ritual practitioners and healers were at a height, and there was a particular kind of like masculinization of the obeah practitioner in that moment as a threat in a way that it doesn't quite apply to enslaved women in the same fashion. Enslaved women are denigrated in other ways with the influx of quote unquote medical men from England and from Scotland in particular as sort of as people who need to be assistants. But in that framing of them, it creates this weird space, because I don't want to make it seem as though enslaved women somehow had it easier, had access to more opportunities, or that this was beneficial for them. But the fact that they were not perceived as being able to be legitimate medical authorities in their own right created this veneer, I think, of safety for a lot of local legislators and medical authorities who felt comfortable having enslaved women assistants in a way that they didn't seem to feel as comfortable having enslaved men, or felt comfortable having free women of color assistants in a way that they didn't feel as comfortable around enslaved men. And to answer the question in the chat regarding the Jamaican archives, the sources that I used were not digitized. I had to go to Spanish Town, but they were incredibly well preserved, and the archivists were extremely helpful. So perhaps after the pandemic subsides, people will be able to gain access again.
Great. Well, thank you all for 3 fantastic papers. I really learned a lot. These are really fantastic connections between Scotland and the Caribbean during a really important period.